Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying Baku so far. My name is Will Kennedy. I lead energy coverage at Bloomberg News, and I'm based in London. And it's a great privilege to be asked by the IMF to moderate today's discussion, which is entitled "The Critical Decade: A Wake-Up Call for Global Climate Action." I'm very lucky to be joined by three fantastic panelists. Ruud de Mooij, who is the Deputy Director of Fiscal Affairs at the IMF, Tine van der Straten, who's Belgium's Energy Minister, and Toni, who is National Secretary of Climate Change in Brazil. So we have a lot of different perspectives, and I think it's going to be, for the next 40 minutes or so, a very interesting discussion. We had hoped to show a quick video summarising IMF's research in this area. We hope to show it to you a bit later. But in the meantime, if I could start with you, Ruud, I know that a team at the IMF has been doing some work on the gap between climate ambition and climate action. So could you just quickly summarise what the team found? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Will. So this research is based on a paper with the same title as for this session, but it actually adds another part of the title, namely Sleepwalking to the Cliff Edge. And I'm going to explain a little bit what we mean by that. So what the paper basically concludes is that our ambition is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, right? You see that everywhere on the signs here in Baku. Keep 1.5 within reach. That's sort of the slogan. And to get there, we know that emissions have to be cut drastically. For 2 degrees Celsius, emissions need to be cut by 25% in 2030 relative to 2019. And for 1.5 degrees, they need to be cut by 50%. So that's our ambition. Now, there's two problems. The first problem is there is a so-called ambition gap. Because if we add all the ambitions that countries have expressed in their NDCs, that add up to around 12% reduction in emissions in 2030 relative to 2019. So ambitions need to be increased, either doubled or quadrupled to achieve these ambitions. But that's not everything, because if we look at implementation, there's also an implementation gap. If we compare sort of the emissions, what happened since 2019, in 2020 we saw a reduction in emissions because of COVID. But since then, we see an increase in emissions every year. So we're not on a path towards this 12% reduction that has been promised by countries. So there's these two gaps, and these two gaps need to be resolved. So the first gap, we're going to have new NDCs next year at COP30. So this is an opportunity to come closer to the ambition that we have expressed in terms of temperature goals. So we hope that this gap will be reduced. But there's a risk too, namely many countries are going to express their NDCs for 2035, which is 10 years from now. So there might be a temptation to say we're going to backload the efforts to achieve those. And that leads to what we call this emissions cliff. If we do nothing between now and 2030, the effort that we need to put into emission reductions after 2030 will be so steep that it becomes unrealistic. So there's the emissions cliff. And we don't want to sleepwalk towards that cliff. So we emphasize very much that we have to act now. It's really urgent to act now. The other is the implementation gap. And the implementation gap, the good news is that we know what needs to be done. There are so many policies that we know are effective. For instance, we need to think about proper carbon pricing. And if we, for instance, compare what is needed in terms of carbon pricing, we did some analysis that shows that if we globally have a carbon price of around $85 per ton, that gets us to a path consistent with 2 degrees Celsius. So for 1.5 degrees, it needs to be much more, but $85 for 2 degrees Celsius. If we compare that with the current price on carbon, which on average is about $5 per ton, you see that there is a huge gap between also the policy ambition to get to what has been promised and and where we are. So these are two main issues from the paper, and of course there's many more issues to be discussed. For instance, international cooperation to get there, which really would be a boost to all this. The issue of climate finance, on which there's many sessions, but I'll leave that for further discussion.
Thank you very much. It's quite a stark warning, and clearly the cliff edge issue, I think, is probably in everyone's mind, as we're only 5 years away from 2030, and every year of delay makes things harder and harder. Tina, you're here leading a European delegation. Clearly the European Union has some of the strongest ambition of all the participants here at COP, but do you think there is any way in which that ambition can be accelerated at a global level to meet or to close the gap that Ruud describes?
Hi, good morning to all of you. Indeed, as you mentioned, European Union has this net zero target to achieve by 2050, and the European Union is now in the process to also adapt its own NDC, the 2040 target. There is at this moment a proposal of the European Commission on the table, and this needs further discussion in the weeks and months to come. There is a new European Commission coming into place with the same commissioner, Wopke Hoekstra, but we also have Teresa Ribera for the clean and just transition. And also we have a new energy commission, as you are speaking about the implementation gap. We have been, during this energy crisis, working on Repower EU by tripling up renewable energies, for example, across EU, and some of the member states have done incredible process. For example, Germany, but also in Belgium, we have done a lot. But as you mentioned, Europe is not alone. But let's not forget that we have an international agreement on the table already, which is the Paris Agreement. A specific supplementary agreement is maybe not necessary, but all coming together and closer cooperation between the larger economies is, I think, of utmost importance, specifically when we need to close the ambition gap. Let's also not forget there is an ongoing policy dialogue already also facilitated by the EU, together with China, for example, also US. Let's see what comes next with the upcoming presidency. And maybe last point is an agreement is one thing. We already have the Paris Agreement, and coming politically closer together with stronger collaboration at political level is between large economies and also large emitters is a desired focus. But let's not forget that we need also this technical cooperation, and that European Commission and European Union also stands ready to share expertise and knowledge, for example, with regard to carbon pricing, the EU ETS that we have, and that this is an existing scheme that can be shared, that can be copied, that can be implemented also in other parts of the world. So a critical decade indeed also for further international deepened cooperation, and specifically between large economies.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up though? I mean, I think if we're honest, we have to be concerned about, you're a politician, you answer ultimately to the Belgian electorate. We have to be concerned globally, don't we, about the political backdrop, the political momentum there to increase our ambition. Electorates seem to be not always interested in the climate perspective. How do we address this task from a political perspective?
Thank you for the question, and I understand the question, but it's a question that ultimately is also disburdening me. Because when we are talking about a backdrop, of course we are referring to the incoming Trump administration, but let's not forget that more than 200 people died only 2 weeks ago. Yep. That Europe was flooded, not only 2 weeks ago in Spain, but also last month, and also in September, but also in Brazil. In Italy is becoming the climate hotspot. So our people, world citizens, are suffering as of today the consequences of climate change. And so we should, at political level, combine ambitious targets but with pragmatic policies by incremental steps. There is nothing wrong with baby steps as long as you set many in the right direction. So I think we should not assume the political backdrop, but as politicians we should point to the urgency that we face today and come up with policies so that people and our children and grandchildren can still be here, because this is the time of now. Otherwise, we should not talk about keeping 1.5 within reach.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Toni, you're here on behalf of Brazil. Brazil, of course, will chair COP next year in Brazil. In the meantime, I think that Brazil is planning a more ambitious, or has announced a more ambitious NDC. Do you want to talk to the group quickly about how Brazil is scaling up its ambition? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure being first day of COP, so really nice being here. As I think has been said, I think is you can see the glass half full or half empty. On the half empty is clear the climate disasters are already with us. We saw what happened in Spain, in the US, in Brazil we had floods, we had fires. So that reality is really very concrete. But I have also good news. And I think we all need a little bit of good news. In Brazil last year we stopped the deforestation in the Amazon by 50%, which means Brazil avoided, in terms of emission, more than 300 million tons of carbon going to the atmosphere. That's very good news. That's almost the amount of emissions of a country like Argentina. We avoided just with stopping deforestation. But the best news is that Brazil, President Lula announced on Friday that Brazil has a new target for 2035, and we will diminish our emission by 2035 up to 67% of our emissions based on 2005. So it's an absolute target, all gases. We do have a net zero target for 2050, and Brazil is an emerging country. So if we can do it, developed countries need to do more. We need, as was suggested by Europe, we need to bring the net zero target of developed countries earlier than 2050, so other developing countries can have the target 2050. The big gap is what our colleague from IMF said, is not lack of ambition. Developing countries like Brazil, we have a huge ambition. We will be leading the COP next year. But it's how we bring the economic governance to also get us to the net zero that we need. Therefore, Brazil we just finished in our G20 presidency, and we brought into the climate task force exactly that debate. Is how can we ensure that the finance governance talks to the climate governance? Because if you have those two governance not talking to each other, we'll never get there.
Can I ask you for some specifics on that new NDC? Where are the places where you're really going to increase that ambition? How are you going to drive that greater reduction in carbon emissions? And obviously, Ruud mentioned carbon pricing. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how Brazil plans to make that part of the picture.
I think by eschewing this very ambitious NDC, cutting 67% of our emissions, what Brazil wants to say is that we don't want to be just a climate champion. We want to be a champion of the new economy, of a low-carbon economy. And what we're doing is redirecting our economy to that. Obviously, Brazil's emissions mostly comes from LULUCF, it comes from deforestation. So we do need to stop deforestation. This is absolutely key for Brazil. We do have many policies in place for the new green industry, for the new green transportation. So the policies are already in place. What we need now is just to accelerate. We have a very good agriculture. Our renewable power sector is 90% of Brazil's power sector is already renewable. 48% of our energy sector is renewable. So I think Brazil is really well placed to be a protagonist in this new economic scenery, but we do need to get finance flows to countries like Brazil. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to achieve the ambitions that we have.
I'll come back to that point about finance later on. That's great. Ruud, having heard the perspective of your colleagues, is there anything more specific you want to say about policy here and the best way that the IMF thinks that we can really address this gap that you've described?
Yeah, thanks, Will. And first of all, thanks a lot for sharing the good news on the new NDC. 67% is really a good target, I guess. Yeah, on policy, we face this huge policy gap, and countries have to think about how to design their policies. We think setting the right incentives through pricing is a critical part of the solution. You see many countries still subsidize fossil fuels. 800 billion in 2023 is spent on fossil fuel subsidies. This creates a perverse incentives for people to deal with fossil fuels. This encourages the consumption of fossil fuels, exactly opposite of what we aim to achieve. This 800 billion compares, for instance, to a revenue from all carbon pricing of 100 billion per year. So it's 8 times as much. And this is not only relevant for incentives, but it's also a high cost for governments in terms of their expenditures. Many governments are very short of cash, face tight fiscal constraints, but spend this amount of money for fossil fuel subsidies. So I think pricing is the centerpiece of how we need to address decarbonization, but it's not everything. We also need to think about complementary policies for certain sectors. For deforestation, I think you need to have complementary policies. For agriculture, you need to have specific policies. We also need investment in infrastructure, green infrastructure. We need investment in research and development. So the whole policy package is sort of a set of complementary policies that are required to get there.
Thank you. Let's pick up on something that Anna mentioned, and is of course probably the primary theme of this COP here in Baku, which is mobilizing more climate finance for the developing world. The 100 billion was reached eventually, but late. But now there's a call for a much more ambitious target. But I think it's a politically difficult thing to achieve. I don't know, Tino, if you can talk a little bit about the European perspective on the new finance target and what Europe would like to achieve or feels is realistic at this COP.
To Europe, it's of utmost importance that these negotiations on climate, which are, it's a word that's used easily, but nevertheless I'm going to do it. These are historical negotiations with regard to finance. Finance forever. Finance is on the negotiation table at COP, but having the new collective quantified goal now ready with a strong core of public and private financing is important, but also accompanied by other supporting policies. I also wanted to echo something that Anna said. First, ambition. It's great that as an incoming COP president that you already have your updated NDC now. And it's also great that you have set up together with UAE, Azerbaijan and you this Troika. And to me it makes totally sense. We have this tripling up and doubling down coming from the UAE dialogue, then the finance this COP, and then the upcoming updated NDCs coming next year. But it cannot end there. And the most important thing, what I wanted absolutely to echo, is what you said about bringing the climate and the finance governance together. I'm talking as an energy minister here. I do agree with you on carbon policies and carbon pricing. And this is a fiscal measure. But it's not going to solve everything. Because as an energy minister, I cannot de-risk for everything. And so when we do the tripling up of renewables, and in my country, for example, we do it through offshore wind. We are the second country worldwide with regard to offshore wind. But all these energy companies and all these off-takers for this clean electricity come to see me to de-risk the huge capex investments. It's billions. We will be building up to 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind in the coming years. Difficult times with cost inflation, prices going very high, very expensive infrastructure that we are building. This cannot be de-risked only by fiscal policies. So we have to review how we do multilateral financing, for example, financial infrastructure, for example, and specifically for the least developed countries. It cannot be accepted anymore that a continent like Africa, with huge resources in solar and wind, for example, and a huge demand. 1 out of 5 people are living in Africa, and most of them do not have access to electricity or clean cooking. But yet these projects are not, at this point in time, cannot be financed due to other reasons, not because of lack of carbon pricing, but because we have these financial infrastructure that does not make it easy or even doable to finance renewable energy projects in Africa. So what you are doing in the G20 by bringing those two governances together is very important, and I really hope that EMF, with also the ministerial dialogues that you have, can also play a role to bring finance, energy and climate ministers together so that we can indeed achieve on implementation.
That's very helpful, and I think we'll come back to the finance piece, but I was quite interested in what you said about Belgium and renewables. I think perhaps one thing that came out of Dubai, and one piece of good news when I look at the energy scene globally, is the pace of renewables deployment, especially in solar. I think wind might be a bit trickier, but we are really seeing huge acceleration in solar. Do you think that we can meet that tripling target that came out of the Dubai COP?
Not meeting it is not an option. As an energy minister, I am optimistic, but we need also what Ruud said about ending or stopping subsidies for fossil fuels is very important. And also, we are third COP in a row in a huge fossil fuel country, and so I really hope that this is not also a meeting place where new fossil fuel deals can be settled. I think we really need to be more firm on the phasing out and the transitioning away from fossil fuels. From a European perspective, we also have Russia. We have these sanctions also ongoing, and also a very commitment from the incoming Commission to end this import from Russian fossil fuels, which can be achieved not only by sanctions on Russian fossil fuels, but also accelerating the deployment of renewable energy.
Thank you very much. Toni, let's go back to finance. You articulated at the beginning how much financial flows are important to closing the gap, and Tina spoke very well about how we need to unlock financial flows to the developing world. Specifically, what does Brazil want to happen here in Baku to make that happen?
I mean, there's several things that first we are already doing in Brazil, but obviously the COP will help. I think as here we are, and we need to decide on the NCQG, the new financial goals, which is absolutely fundamental for the trust on the regime, and especially, as was mentioned, for some of the developing world, is absolutely key. But even if we get to a number 3 million, 300 million, 400 million, God knows which number we're going to get out here, we know it's not enough, because we need to talk about the trillions. So we also need to talk about private resources, not just cooperation, going to the developing world. And as was suggested, the cost of financing renewables, or the risks that is set by financing renewables or forest-related products in countries like Brazil or in Africa, is just too high. So if we want the whole world to decarbonize, we cannot just solve our own problem. Like in Europe, they have fiscal space for it, and you have done your new Green Deal. In the US, they had the IRA. in Brazil or in Africa or other countries, they don't have that fiscal space. So we need to think globally. And I think was said, we need to reform the financial system. We need to ensure that the financial system has the same goals in terms of which economy is needed to decarbonize. In case of Brazil, and what we hope to get out of here is a substantial financial commitment from the developed world to the developing world. That's absolutely key. Secondly, we need to finalize the negotiation about carbon markets. Carbon markets are fundamental in that process. And we've been discussing this topic here for 9 years, so it's time to finish. And I hope, again, Brazil will bring some good news. Tomorrow we have a debate in Parliament back in Brazil, and hopefully Brazil will announce our new carbon market, a national carbon market. And we are putting as a proposal here as well something called the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, which is how can we value standing forest? Because at the moment, standing forest has no value, economic value. It's better for somebody that has a piece of land full of forest to deforest and then sell soya. So standing forest has not been valued. We need to change that. Otherwise, we're going to see deforestation happening not only in countries like Brazil or in the Amazon, but in Congo and Indonesia and all the other countries. So we need to think more creatively about new economic mechanisms, and that's why we brought together on the G20 central bank presidents, finance ministers, and climate ministers to sit together for an entire year to think about what new economic mechanisms are needed, and country platforms and these facilities for forests. There are several instruments. We just need to make them at scale now.
Thank you for raising the forest issue, because I think obviously it's critical to Brazil, and I think people expect it to be a big part of your COP in Belém next year. Can you give any more detail about exactly how Brazil would like that to work? And I think people would be very interested to hear exactly what that mechanism might look like.
Hopefully, it's already super clear for the entire world. If a country like Brazil, if we deforest the Amazon, not only, the tipping point on nature, but we are going to be issuing more than, I can't remember the numbers, it's 1 trillion carbon emissions. So we don't want to do that. But obviously, there are lots of poor people in the Amazon, and we need to give them alternatives so that they can sell, for example, bioeconomy with selling nuts. So that new economy of the bioeconomy needs to be thought about. So that will be a highlight in our COP, is forest economy. How can we value forests? And obviously for cosmetic, for new medicines, a lot of the new products will come from the forest. And although it will be an important forest COP, we don't want also to be just a forest COP because of the topic that was just mentioned by Belgium. The big problem in the world is stopping fossil fuel. No, we need to stop our dependency on fossil fuel. So at the Brazilian COP, hopefully coming from COP29, we will also have the mandate to say, how are we going to diminish our dependence on fossil fuel? What can be done? Increasing renewables is one way, but as was said, there are other things we need to do, is stopping subsidies. What are the other things that need to be done to also diminishing our dependency on fossil fuel?
Thank you very much. If I could come back to you, Ruud. Obviously, we've been talking about finance, increasing finance ambition, reforming the financial system to better see the flow of finance across the world. Clearly, institutions like the IMF have a big role to play, and I don't necessarily want to ask you about huge policy questions that are outside your remit, but in the day-to-day work of the IMF, how is it trying to answer these questions and increase its role in climate finance?
Yeah, thanks, Will. So, well, the study that was published today is part of a climate strategy that the IMF has adopted in 2021, recognizing that climate change is really a macro-critical issue. So if we do nothing, we're doomed, basically. There will be huge costs. So all these investments, compared to a scenario where there's no action against climate change, is a huge benefit for the world. So that recognition led to this climate strategy, and it's reflected in all the work that the IMF does, which is surveillance, lending, and capacity development. So in surveillance, we do integrate climate issues in the exchange that we have with countries on an annual basis in our Article 4 consultations. So we discuss policies, we develop tools for analyzing policies, and we discuss these issues with countries. And as you mentioned, the IMF also has a convening role here in bringing countries together and create sort of a common language, a common conceptual analysis for discussing these issues, but also to bring, for instance, finance ministers together. We are, together with the World Bank, the Secretariat of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, where we discuss among finance ministers similar issues. And I think what you said, these ministers should also meet with the climate ministers and the energy ministers to discuss the concrete policies. So we also have, very briefly, our lending. We have a resilience and sustainability trust, which contains $40 billion that can be deployed for lending operations by the fund. 20 countries have already a resilience and sustainability facility covering $10 billion US. So we play our part, and this is policy-based lending. So with it comes conditionality with respect to reforming certain policies or adopting certain practices in terms of public financial management and so on. And then there's the capacity development. So we also help countries build capacity to deal with climate issues, both on the adaptation side and on the mitigation side.
Thank you very much for that summary. We're almost out of time, and I know that our panelists have lots of other things they need to get done today. But before we finish, are there any questions from the audience at all for any of our panelists? Yep, just here.
Thank you.
I think there's a microphone just behind you.
Thanks. My name is Fisal Qureshi, and I'm from Pakistan. My question is from you on IMF, and Pakistan has a lot of programs with IMF, and you talked about the subsidy on the fossil fuels, but in Pakistan's case, in fact, there was the subsidy on the solar panels, but due to the IMF program, and the one condition was to stop that subsidy. And the civil society raised that concern, but it was not really got that much result. So what would you say in this regard? We really see the things other way around. So thank you.
I apologize, I don't know the specifics of the situation, but I think in general, many countries subsidize the fossil fuels. So the question is, however, do we need to subsidize solar power? Because in many circumstances, solar power or wind power is more profitable than power generated by fossil fuels. So I think in the beginning, there was a need for sort of subsidizing these emerging technologies. But at some point, I think this really became economically viable by itself. So in that case, it's no longer necessary to provide the subsidies. So maybe, but I'm just speculating on the specifics.
Tina, did you want to say something?
Yes, I don't know the specific program either, but it's probably, it is economically viable on its own. If you can pay for it, if you can finance it, and in many parts of the world you cannot pay for it or you cannot finance it, and then your economic model that says or that tells you that it's economic viable, this is causing the political backdrop. This is causing having no public support. I'm absolutely convinced that if we, and what you said is so true, if Brazil can do it and developed countries it needs to ring a bell that we can do more. And sometimes we are lagging behind, and we need really to cut down fossil fuel consumption and everything that comes with it. And in Baku, we need to build on the momentum that was achieved in Dubai. Otherwise, you will have a very difficult COP. If the transitioning away from fossil fuel is now disappearing or just weakened a little bit, and we are very far from home. Because then you will not reach your 67 target, because everyone globally is counting on carbon sinks like the Amazon, like Congo forest. But we already have the positive, the feedback effects from climate change, which will not, if you stop deforestation, the negative effects that we already have, the Amazon and also the Congo basin, if we don't stop it, but if we continue to use fossil fuels also, then it will be more difficult to reach your target. So I'm with you.
Can I just...
Sure, please.
I was just going to say, and it's not the case of Pakistan, the reason why Brazil has been so ambitious in our own NDC, obviously because we are nice people, but not quite, is because Brazil is super vulnerable to climate change. As I said, we have 90% of our energy comes from renewable, a lot of it from hydro. And therefore, we do need the rain from the Amazon. We obviously have forest and agriculture, so we do need the rain, the rain that it comes. And the cost of inaction is so much more expensive. We had a disaster in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, cost Brazil 100 billion reais. That 100 billion, if we were using for the renewables or stopping deforestation, would be so much better. So I just hope we're not going to from one COP to another COP and say, oh, all my solidarity is to our friends in Spain or the friends in US or the friends in Brazil that has just passed through a huge climate disaster. We are becoming natural to those disasters. We cannot allow that to happen because the cost of inaction, the lives that we are losing is so much more important than the money, the risks, the financial risks that we have not moved the money fast enough to the countries that needs to be implementing those policies.
Thank you. We're going to have to end it there, I'm afraid, but thank you all for a very stimulating and in some cases optimistic discussion. Please join me in thanking Ruud, Tina and Anna for their time this morning.